Sure, this novel is technically existential horror in a bottle, but I mean, how bad could it be if there are no men around? I think I could handle being the last of my race if it meant I never had to deal with another man trying to flirt with me at my workplace. Welcome back to the madness. My name is Erin, and today we're staring into the abyss, and staring back at us is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Oppmann. Despite the fact that this novel sounds like it might be a lesbian manifesto, it's actually an existentially horrifying science fiction novel from the 90s, where all of the existential horror is born. How do I know that? I was born in the 90s. What is existential horror? I hear you asking. Well, if you're an American, there's a 1 in 2 chance you're feeling it right about now. According to psychologist Erin Liat Claridge, no relation, the term existential terror refers to the cognitive and emotional experience of recognizing the inevitability of death, which is often accompanied by feelings of angst, isolation from others, and the awareness of meaninglessness. The existential horror genre is exploring these sentiments and often focuses on how insignificant humanity is in the grand scope of the universe through isolation and apathy. Let's break this down a little bit more. Existentialism is a field of philosophy that is neighbors with ontology, which is the study of being. These philosophers see the nature of the human condition as incredibly important, and by the human condition I mean like the purpose, the meaning of our existence from birth to death. The word existentialism comes from the word existence, so it's easy to see that it's a school of philosophy where human existence is at the center of the discussion. Now, everyone's got a different take on why we as humans exist, as some good, some bad. Existential horror preys upon the more negative schools of thought. There is no meaning to life. We exist to suffer. We don't matter. No one is going to remember us. There is nothing after death. There is something after death, but it's far worse than we've imagined. There's nothing more to the world than what's around us. What we see is all there is. There is no escape to our dehumanization by the people in power. We will be reduced to nothing, and there's nothing we can do about it. Existential horror is also relative to the person. Someone might be comforted by the idea that there's nothing after death the same way it might horrify somebody else. Something I've always said is that it's the not knowing that kills you, and existential horror loves forcing people to confront how much they don't fucking know. I love this genre. Horror as a genre is what we'd call an emotional genre, in that it's a genre where its classification elements is focused on eliciting a specific emotion, fear, horror, or unease. It's a triplet, with the 2 other members of the trio being comedy, which wants to elicit joy and laughter, and erotica, which is designed to titillate. But Erin, you say, what about tragedies? Those are designed to make you sad. Which, you are correct, dear reader, but tragedy is not necessarily a genre that's marketed in the modern day. Most people, when asked to name a tragedy, are going to name something like Romeo and Juliet or Orpheus and Eurydice. Tragedy, poor girl, has currently been demoted from genre to a narrative element, and only if we actually start marketing the tragedy as a genre for which they get their own section in a library or bookstore, will I consider her a genre once again. I say this knowing that I wrote a tragedy and I don't fucking know how to market it to agents because it's not a genre anymore. I think if we all collectively got angry about this the way we got angry when Pluto got demoted, we could successfully get the publishing industry to reinstate tragedy as a genre. But as of now, she's just an element. You cannot be a horror novel if you're not trying to generate a sense of fear, horror, or unease. With that in mind, I feel like it's debatable if this is science fiction with horror elements, sort of like Frankenstein, or sci-fi horror like Dead Space. As I'm saying the word horror over and over again, I have this distinct memory of when I was in 5th grade and I called someone a horror, and they thought I called her a whore. And I didn't know what that word meant, and when I clarified horror, everyone visibly relaxed. I don't know why all those 5th graders knew the word whore. Anyways, moving on. The difference between I Who Have Never Known Men having horror elements and being in the horror genre is how large of a role it plays in the overall plot of the story, that being the horror parts. A really good example of this is actually the Tomb Raider Survivor trilogy, so 2013 reboot, Rise of the Tomb Raider, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. These are unambiguously not horror games, however, towards the end, each story in each game, we get one level designed to frighten you. The Survivor trilogy are all magical realism, and when we get to the magical realism part, the game starts to frighten you with fantastical creatures that shouldn't exist, jump scares, and random skeletons hanging from a noose, and it's got the shotgun, and the shotgun makes you feel safe, but you gotta walk all the way up to the corpse to get it, and it's terrifying, it is scary. It's a totally universal experience, and not the fact that I, Aaron, cannot handle horror in video games to save my life. Anyways, so we wouldn't call Tomb Raider a horror game because it has one level designed to terrify, but that's undoubtedly horror, so we say it has horror elements. So why am I struggling to say whether I Who Have Never Known Men is horror or just has horror elements? It really depends on your interpretation of the existential horror. Because to me, the existential horror permeates the entire narrative, but I could also see someone arguing that it's not. Tomb Raider might be a very clear-cut example of knowing where the genre comes and goes, but most stories are not that clear. This is a decision a reader is going to have to make by themselves, which you're going to be hearing a lot, because this book is ambiguous. A lot is left up to interpretation, and this book handles it very well. We begin at the beginning. Let's look at the back of the book, realize it's crowded with blurbs from authors saying how good the book is, open up the dust jacket, realize there's only an author bio there, and then finally, with shame, load up a search engine so we can actually read the synopsis of this novel. Let's begin. Deep underground, 39 women lived imprisoned in a cage. Watched over by guards, these women have no memories of how they got there, no notion of time, and only a vague recollection of their lives before. As the burn of the electric light merges day into night, and numberless years pass, a young girl, the 40th prisoner, sits alone and outcast in the corner. Soon she will show herself to be the key to the others' escape and survival in a strange world that awaits them above ground. Jacqueline Arpman was born in Ederbeek, Belgium, in 1929, and fled to Casablanca with her family during World War II. Informed by her background as a psychoanalyst and her youth in exile, I Who Have Never Known Men is a haunting, heartbreaking post-apocalyptic novel of female friendship and intimacy, and the lengths people will go to maintain their humanity in the face of devastation. Back in print for the first time since 1977, Arpman's modern classic is an important addition to the growing canon of feminist speculative literature. Wow, so that's a lot. We've got something fairly unique with a small author bio. Everything in a novel must serve a purpose, and that includes what's written in the synopsis, too. The author bio was included for a reason, and we will get into it. But first, the hook. You cannot count on every reader reading the entire synopsis, but generally you can get them to read the first sentence or two. Deep underground, 39 women lived imprisoned in a cage. Watched over by guards, the women have no memory of how they got there, no notion of time, and only a vague recollection of their lives before. And this hook holds a lot of information. We're underground, there's cages, women, guards, memory wiping, time displacement, and a general sense of confusion, and a partridge in a pear tree. The thing that sticks out to me the most is there are 39 women. When we use denominations of 5 and 10, we might not find meaning in that, but 39? Why 39? It's intriguing. Let's keep going. As the burn of electric light merges day into night and numberless years pass, a young girl, the 40th prisoner, sits alone and outcast in the corner. Soon she will show herself to be the key to the others' escape and survival in a strange world that awaits them above ground. What I find most impressive about the synopsis is that it's so well written that you can interpret the meaning of it. Here is our 40th prisoner. So it's 40 women total. But the way that the synopsis sets it up from 39 to 40, we already know that the 40th prisoner is different and set apart from the crowd. She's literally separated from the other woman by the paragraphs in the synopsis. And then there's, of course, we have this reiterated in the rest of the paragraph. This is the introduction to our protagonist. She is not named in the book and referred to as the child a couple of times, and for this podcast we will call her La Fille, which is French for the female child. We also get some promises of plot in this part that La Fille is going to be the person who helps her adult companions escape and survive on the surface. We're also getting our first reveal in the book before opening it up. The women are imprisoned, yes, but they are going to escape their confinement. And that's terrifying. It's terrifying when you already know that they're gonna succeed, because what happens after? That means everything that's important is gonna be what happens after. It's not about the escape, it's about what's on that surface. That's kind of terrifying. And by doing this, we're shifting the question from do they escape to how do they escape. We're anticipating the exit and are watching for it. Let's continue. Jacqueline Hoffman was born in Etterbeek, Belgium in 1929 and fled to Casablanca with her family during World War II. Informed by her background as a psychoanalyst and her youth in exile, I Who Have Never Known Men is a haunting, heartbreaking, post-apocalyptic novel of female friendship and intimacy, and the lengths people will go to maintain the humanity in the face of devastation. Back in print for the first time in 1997, Hoffman's modern classic is an important addition to the growing canon of feminist speculative literature. So this is strange, right? Typically in a synopsis, we don't really get a little author bio. Sometimes we might get a sentence or two, but this is a full paragraph. Everything in a novel must serve a purpose. At the end of the novel, we get an afterword that explains the context to I Who Have Never Known Men, and the main takeaway of this afterword is that the Holocaust is a major influence on the creation of this story. Put this in your back pocket, we will be coming back to this influence. With this section of the synopsis, we're hinting at that context. It's important for us readers to know right now, out the gate, that Achman is a Jewish World War II survivor, and she is informed by her background in psychology. We should not be shocked that there's a lot of philosophy going on around here. There's also a promise of theme here, which is female friendships, intimacy, and the indomitable human spirit. All of this is delivered upon in the story. We get it all. The thing that interests me the most is female friendships because of its tumultuous history. In pre-modern Europe, there was this outright fear if women could gather without men, they'd share intimate details about their lives with other women. Births were a female-only space and one of the few places women could be together without men. Gossip is a term that developed in this period specifically about women who speak to other women about their personal lives and comment on other women's personal lives. Something fairly common in literature and storytelling up until fairly recently was to see women without friends, or if there are two women in the cast, they're either competing love interests or they secretly hate each other. And sure, that can be true sometimes. I was in a friend group that hated each other, but not every female friendship is Mean Girls. The Bechdel test was created in 1985 in response to this observation of how few female characters there are in media and how they tend to interact with each other. This test comes from a comic in which one girl has 3 rules about watching a movie, which is 1, there must be 2 female characters, 2, they must have a conversation, and 3, the conversation must not be about a man. And the joke is that the last film she was able to see was Alien because the 2 women talk about the monster. Since this comic, the Bechdel test has become important to women. It influences how they interact with movies, and I think since its inception, it's been expanded to require a named female character, really raising the bar to an impossible standard, aren't we? People say that the failing of this test doesn't mean a movie is bad, and they're correct. The Bechdel test isn't designed to test for quality, it's designed to test for diversity. It raises awareness to how androcentric storytelling tends to be. We have to do something with this observation, which is to tell more stories with women in them and give them more lines than just talking about men. I Who Have Never Known Men was written in 1995, and I would say that the desire to focus on female friendships is a response to this complicated history of female friendships and storytelling, but also in real life, the kind that spawned the Bechdel test in the first place. The book's original language is French, and its French title is Moi qui n'ai pas connu les hommes, which is nearly one-to-one in its translation to English. Literally, word for word, it says, I who have not known the men. We're not losing much in translation, which is good. It originally being in French is why I'm also using French pronunciations for Achman's name. I'm just trying to use context clues here. I love that this title is unambiguously connected to the novel. I don't think you could have called this book anything else except for I Who Have Never Known Men. Lafia, our protagonist, is characterized by the fact that she is too young to remember anything before ending up in the prison with the 39 other women, so she literally knows nothing of men. Her worldview is detached from patriarchy because she lacks the experience, even though the life she ends up living is undeniably a result of a bygone patriarchal system. Lafia has never known men, but men have known her. Now that the patriarchal system is gone, she will never have the chance to know men in a meaningful way. She understands them as an extinct creature who are nothing more than fragments of memory and a handful of stories passed down by the other women. The title also just sounds cool as fuck. I don't judge books by their covers, but I do judge them by their titles, and my most toxic trait is that sometimes I will just look at a book's title and give it the most passing glance of the synopsis and then add it to my TBR. Because I make my TBR a year out in advance, by the time I get to actually reading, I have forgotten what most of these books are about. I just have to trust that past Erin knew what she was doing. I have 9 books on hold right now, and I don't remember what 8 of them are about. Welcome to intermission. Time to grab a drink, grab some food, use the bathroom, park your car and pick up your next delivery, put the kettle on, abandon hope, all ye who enter here. Not only will I be spoiling the entirety of this novel, it will be spoiled in great detail. This is a critical analysis of the book, so if you would like to read I Who Have Never Known Men unburdened by spoilers, now is your time to jump ship. But if you're already caught up to speed or don't care about spoilers, don't worry, neither do I. Then buckle up, Buttercup, we're hitting the ground, recovering from all of our bone shattering, and then we are running. How do I explain the plot of this novel? This novel is abstract, and it's an allegory, with a lot left up to interpretation, so you're just gonna have to trust the process, okay? This novel is about a prison that houses 39 women and 1 girl. None of these women know each other, nor do they understand how they ended up in this prison. They're not allowed to touch each other, and they are guarded by silent men who do not make eye contact with them, nor interact with them any other way than to threaten them should they break the rules. The women remember parts of their past lives, but moments leading up to the capture are a blur. The girl, Lafia, our protagonist, has no memory of the life before because of how young she was when she was brought into the prison. At the start of the story, Lafia is a preteen who doesn't connect with the other women because they refuse to satiate her natural curiosity of how the world works. The women feel it's a waste of time to explain to Lafia things that she will never experience. Lafia's curiosity is what you'd expect out of a preteen, from bodily function to the prison itself. Things change when, and I am not joking, Lafia discovers orgasms, which she calls the eruption. Relatable content. Lafia could have gone on to be the greatest smut writer of our generation if she had been born in our century. This comes about because one of the guards is much younger than the rest, and she incorporates him into her sexual fantasies. The most interesting detail from this is that she imagines a very sexy interrogation between her and the guard. It's not graphic, just as some vague nods to the content of her fantasies, but it's interesting that she's imagined being interrogated by the guard. The women notice this, and then there's this really silly power struggle between the elder women trying to get Lafia to admit what she's thinking about, and Lafia outright refusing because she understands that any power dynamics in the cage are imaginary. The elder women cannot punish her. They can't even touch her. Anthea is a woman Lafia trusts and one of the few that tend to answer her questions. When Anthea realizes that Lafia is angry at the other women by brushing off her curiosity, Anthea attempts to be more open, giving Lafia everything that women figured out about their imprisonment. And Lafia is a determined girl going on a woman, and she uses heartbeats to figure out a way to tell time. I believe it's an average minute, there's 72 heartbeats per minute, and that's how they figure out how long a minute is, and from that they can create a full 24-hour clock. And as time goes on, Lafia is able to do all the arithmetic in her head and becomes this walking, talking clock who always knows the time. Before this, the women had no way to tell time, so this is their first act of rebellion to take back control in this prison. Lafia's next act of rebellion was to get a young guard to acknowledge her. The guards don't interact with the women save for cracking the whip should they disobey the rules, and she wants the young guard, the one that is the subject of her sexual fantasies, to acknowledge her. But this attempt is cut short when an alarm blares and the men vanish, one dropping a set of keys. This allows the women to escape, reaching the surface to discover everyone gone and a temperate plain with occasional hills and scattered trees. Lafia narrates something here that I love, which is something like, "We got out of the prison but did not realize that the surface would be our next prison." It's so dismal that we get to freedom, but we are warned by the protagonist that this is not going to end well. There are no other cities. All the women discover are more bunkers, but every prisoner is found dead, bunker after bunker, some men and some with women. The cages are impossible to escape even with 40 people working together. It becomes clear that there is no way off these plains, which might not even be Earth, and the women set down roots by rivers, scavenging supplies from a bunker as they needed. They build houses and fall in love. They live, they die. Lafia grows into a young woman. It does get acknowledged fairly early in the novel outright, but I had the realization very quickly that Lafia was going to outlive all of the women, and that's exactly what happens. One by one they pass away, often with Lafia performing a killing blow to their heart for an instant painless death if the women were suffering. I would not say that Lafia is a bringer of death, but a bringer of change, and death is a part of that. She's the only one of the women with no reservations about performing mercy killing. So when Lafia is the last of her kind and alone, she leaves the town the women built and continues to explore the bunkers. And she's determined to make more discoveries about them, like how they're arranged in sets of 5. There's one in the center and then 4 that offshoot from them. There's one bunker where she finds a dead man sitting upright as if determined to die with dignity, and Lafia knows that this is how she wants to die, just like this man. But she keeps going and ends up finding a secret underground hatch that has this entire house built down there, and this is where she settles down for the remainder of her life. I guess I who have never known men walked so that Lost could run. She makes more journeys out to the bunkers, but as she gets older, she becomes tired. She soon falls to some affliction of the womb and then decides to write down her journey, revealing that this is an epistolary. It ends with her commenting on how she is going to die in her bed sitting upright like the dead man she saw earlier, and that there's something of a grand irony that she is dying of an affliction of the womb. Lafia, who has never had a period, who has never known men. Is everyone understanding how we got from discovered orgasm to the slow existential dread of being the last woman alive with no answers on how we got there? Great! Me neither. I only speak in jest. This novel does abstraction and ambiguity very well. This book is everything that The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay attempted to be. If you're a fan of like David Lynch or House of Leaves, this novel will intrigue you. There's a lot of space given to develop theories and interpret the work. Most importantly, this book isn't trying too hard to have an abstract aesthetic. Aaron, what do you mean by that? Well, I'm glad you didn't ask. The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay is a novel that tried to be abstract but had little more than an abstract aesthetic. It failed for me because Tremblay refused to confirm any details, because if he confirmed a single detail, it would then be evidence to suggest that one of the 2 possible endings are more correct than the other. The main question of that book is whether or not an apocalyptic event is happening or not. We're stuck in this state of unconfirmed and I don't know. The story just doesn't make sense to me if there's no apocalyptic event, and I don't think a book can call itself ambiguous if the other possibility suggested simply doesn't make sense. Cabin at the End of the World also presents its ambiguous ending as one of 2 possible answers. That feels antithetical to abstract storytelling. Is it really up for interpretation if we're being told that there are only 2 interpretations and what those 2 interpretations are? There's this illusion of space given to us so we can interpret what is going on, but it is an illusion. So what does it look like with abstract storytelling that works? Well, I think Zampano in House of Leaves is secretly the god Dionysus. And in the video game Immortality, I think Marissa Marcel is a continuation of a pattern set by Joan of Arc and Saint Genevieve. Neither of these interpretations were posed by the authors of these stories. It's just stuff I saw in the writing and found evidence to support my claims. And other people have different theories that have nothing to do with mine, and that's okay because that's what abstract writing is meant to do. All of the unconfirmed data of Cabin at the End of the World ultimately funnels you to one of 2 possible outcomes, and as I said before, no detail can be confirmed because it will give credence to one ending over the other. It feels like being a professional bowler with the gutter rails on. Contrast this with I Who Have Never Known Men, where we likewise have a lack of answers, but this comes from a lack of an avenue to get the answer. So why is it working in I Who Have Never Known Men and not Cabin at the End of the World? It works in I Who Have Never Known Men because 1, we're not being funneled to any pre-selected outcomes. But that aside, we're getting partial answers and several discoveries that readers can use as evidence to support their own theories. We don't know why the men intentionally displace time, but we discover the displacement. We don't know why the women are there, but we discover they're not the only prisoners. All of these pieces of information can be used to develop hundreds of different theories. There are no wrong answers. This technique that the author is using in I Who Have Never Known Men is called writing around the answer. As a writer, you need to know every answer to every question in your story, even if you never plan on telling the readers those answers. Knowing these answers allows us to write around it. Think of the way an artist draws in negative space. The picture becomes clear by what isn't drawn instead of what is. When we write around the answer, we present evidence to our readers to develop theories, but even still, it's not enough to say for sure what is correct and what isn't. When we're not writing around the answer, it can become painfully obvious that an author wanted to have ambiguity, but also did not want to decide what the correct answer was. Try to draw something using the negative space, but don't decide on what you're drawing. And you're gonna be like, Aaron, I can't. How can you draw something in the negative space if you don't know what you're drawing? Exactly. When we're not writing around the answer, it can become painfully obvious that the author wanted to have ambiguity but did not decide what the correct answer was. This means there's nothing in the story to make any meaningful interpretations. The audience grasps at incoherent straws because anything that might suggest an answer is there for quote-unquote interpretation reasons, but not intended to lead to a concrete answer. It's like putting a bullet casing in the room so the reader can interpret something from that, and not because the gun is the murder weapon. A great example of this is Encanto. The writers admitted in an interview they didn't answer the question why Mirabel doesn't get magic. Despite this being the inciting incident of the movie, they don't write around the answer because they didn't decide the answer. There's nothing there to grasp but straws. And look, I know what all the leading theories are in Encanto. I don't need to be educated on them. My point is that the writers told us they never intended to answer it and didn't answer it, and so any evidence you find is not a clue. How do you draw in the negative without knowing what the picture's supposed to be? Mirabel doesn't get magic because Casita decided not to give it to her. That's it. There's nothing else there. And here's the thing. A writer could decide not to answer the questions, but their writing can be so strong that it feels like there's an answer, and so Encanto still could have gotten away with it, but the story doesn't feel very presented like there was an answer. It really feels like they really didn't answer it. I Who Have Never Known Men, likewise, equally either knows the answer to each question the book poses, or it's written strong enough to suggest that it knows the answer. We don't know a lot of information, but we learn enough through the world with confirmed information to develop solid theories. One of the beliefs the women in the prison have based on the evidence is that the men's main priority is keeping women in the dark about their imprisonment. We never know why they want this, only that it's important to them. It's our job as a reader to consider why this is important to them. And something that I think is important to a lot of ambiguous writing, especially if the characters in the story are aware that there is a mystery needing to unfurl, is that sometimes they can develop their own theories as to what they think is going on. I think that sometimes when ambiguous endings and ambiguous storytelling failing is either when they either ride too hard into developing theories and they don't give readers a chance to interpret, or they never develop a single theory, and it's like, you're not thinking this through once? Developing a single theory? Like in Encanto, Mirabel never asks why she didn't get her magic. She never comes up with a single theory, but in Cabin at the End of the World, they come up with theories and they stick to them, and the readers don't get room to develop anything else. So it's a balancing act. Everything in writing is a balancing act. Writers are tightrope rockers, always on the verge of tumbling over, because whether or not they fall is subjective to the reader. Abstract storytelling tends to point to a reader to a cluster of answers and theories. So it's kind of like a galaxy, you know? A galaxy is a cluster of star systems and planets and meteors, or not meteors, and comets and all of those things. And so abstract storytelling will point you to the entirety of the Milky Way galaxy, right? You know, there is so much there, right? That even though we're in this similar cluster, it's okay because there's a lot of room in that cluster. Most people reading House of Leaves are going to connect the maze to the Greek labyrinth. Most people who watch Petscop are going to have theories about artificial intelligence. The fun of abstraction is being able to take this information that everyone else has and seeing if you can find something new in it, or feel more confident in other theories that have been stated by other people. And you could have crack theories, which make the world go round. In Petscop, the evidence tends to suggest AI is involved in the narrative, but I love the idea of a ghost being trapped in the game so much that my theories tend to lean towards people being trapped in the game more than AI. Is it crazier? Yes. Am I having fun? Also, yes. So, in our galaxy sort of metaphor, this would be the equivalent of everyone's kind of being pointed to the Milky Way, and you decide, fuck that, I'm going to Andromeda. Now, these clusters appear because the writers know what the answer is, or the writing is strong enough that we think there's a concrete answer. So, of course, we're going to end up in roughly the same area of theory. I think sometimes when writers approach ambiguity, they're so focused on the audience talking and interpreting that they forget the key ingredient to pulling it off is having intentional and concrete data and information for the audience to build theories off of. It takes more than just not answering stuff in a novel and going, oh, what's the answer? Nobody knows. Spooky, isn't it? Maybe you have to figure it out for yourself. We need more. We need data. This is where the cabin at the end of the world struggles. It reads like the author did not decide if the apocalypse of the story was real, which made it impossible to write around the answer. I will never be able to tell you with assurance if I, who have never known men, knows the answers to its questions, the way I can't tell you if most stories do this. But the writing makes it seem like it knows, and that's all that matters. It's important that we, the readers, feel like the book knows the answers even if we never get them. The book needs to have confidence. The book needs to have riz. The last thing I want to touch on for the plot is Lafia as a clock. Before the counting of the heartbeats to determine what a minute was in order to get a sense of time, Lafia was still a clock. She was so young that she was easy for the women to measure time by how fast Lafia was growing. There isn't much a distinction between a 30 and a 35-year-old, but there's a huge distinction between a 10 and 15-year-old. I find it really interesting and clever that Lafia is an embodiment of the passage of time from prison to the grave. Not to compare this to Lost again, but Lost also does this where they use Claire as sort of a passage of time because she's pregnant. So they're like, the clock is ticking because Claire is eventually going to give birth. I wonder if the people who created Lost ever read this book, because they have a lot in common. And I'm here for it. I truly am here for it. Not in a plagiaristic way, more in a they just have a lot of common themes kind of way. Alright, Lords and Germs, time to get a flashback back to your 10th grade English class, because we're going to be talking about allegories. My English 10 teacher described it best. Allegories are symbolism on crack. These are stories written to have hidden meaning, often directly referencing something philosophical, moral, or political. The difference between an allegory and a metaphor is that a metaphor is a comparison of two things, whereas an allegory is a complete narrative where everything tends to represent something else. Allegories are taught in the American public school system, usually through the book Fahrenheit 451, which is a retelling of Plato's Cave. Plato's Cave is also an allegory, so we're having allegoryception here. In Plato's Cave, a man is tied up in a cave. Sunlight pours in and hits the only wall that the man can see. Every night, people pass through the cave with puppets that cast shadows on the wall, and the man believes the entire world is these shadows because it's all he has ever known. When he breaks out into the light of day, he breaks out into a world he does not recognize because all he had known were shadows. Yet he is more intellectually fulfilled because his pursuit of curiosity, he has learned and gained a better understanding of how the world works. There is more to the universe than what others choose to show us, and it is our job to find those answers. Fahrenheit 451 retells this story with a focus on how a person might end up in the cave itself. What keeps people in caves? What stops them from wanting to go outside? This is how we end up with the book being a dystopia with a totalitarian government. There's something morbidly humorous about people today who mindlessly follow in line with their favorite politicians, and they accuse their opponents of not thinking critically and being sheep. The call is coming from inside the house, my dear. The war the American right wing wage on academia is a result of this. If the right wing can rebrand education as indoctrination, then they can have an uneducated population, which is much easier to control. Allegories tell stories about its subject without it actually being about that subject. Everything in the story is a symbol. It represents something in the subject the author wants to talk about. Everything in Fahrenheit 451 represents something in Plato's Cave, and everything in Plato's Cave represents something in the concept of pursuing knowledge. I Who Have Never Known Men is an allegory for the Holocaust. This is why the synopsis gives us key information about our author being a refugee fleeing World War II. And if you read the book, this influence will be pointed out and discussed in the afterward. So let's take a look at the prose and see where this allegory actually manifests. The prisons. The prisons are divided by gender, guarded by men who seek only to punish the prisoners with what feels like arbitrary rules, and the people in prison are there for seemingly no reason, with no clear understanding of where it will end. The women conclude that the only thing they can do is wait to die. This is a representation of the concentration camps. The alarms. When the alarms go off in the plot, the guards abandon the 40 women prisoners to die. In World War II, as Allied troops were closing in on other camps, SS officers were trying to move prisoners to different camps, but in most of these camps, a lot of the prisoners were simply left behind to presumably die. Mass death. The Holocaust killed about 6 million Jews and about 500,000 non-Jews, specifically in the concentration camps. Though there is a lot of misinformation about this number, you'll see 11 million show up with 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews, but that's been debunked. The Third Reich, which is what the Nazi regime also called itself, was eliminating anyone they saw as a threat, with the Jewish people as their main target. So in this story, when we travel from bunker to bunker with Lafia and the 40 survivors fighting nothing but death and death and more death, it's to generate a sense of loss. There were roughly 9 million Jewish people in Europe during the Nazi regime, and 2/3 of them died. Lafia and her cohort represent the Holocaust survivors, and all of these prisons filled with all of this dead represent the ones who did not make it. The second prison. So when Lafia and the survivors escape the bunker, Lafia alludes to the outside world being itself another prison. This is representative of the anti-Semitism that persisted even after the fall of the Third Reich, but also the fact that some Jews ended up in holding camps like MacLeod, which were while trying to enter Israel. It was one thing to survive the Holocaust, an entirely different beast to figure out how to survive in a world that exists after such an atrocity, especially nowadays when anti-Semitism is still on the rise, which is just ridiculous. We don't know why we're here. So, something that the women all discover about themselves is they don't know why they're being held prisoner, and none of them seem to know each other. This feels entirely deliberate. All of these women are lower class. Store clerks, cleaning ladies, housewives. The decision to never tell us why these prisons existed, why these women were there, why they don't know each other, is to generate a sense of meaninglessness from the Holocaust. The Third Reich proposed reasons why the Jewish people deserved this, yes, but their reasoning is founded in nothing but hate. People were being murdered because the people in power wanted to kill them. Jews in this era were also told many different stories as to why they were going to the camps, the major one being told that this is a work camp. With the power of hindsight, we can understand what these camps were intended for, but during the war, it wasn't so clear. We didn't know about these camps for a really long time. I think I, who have never known men, does a great job at representing the dread horror of simply not knowing why you were selected to suffer in someone else's game of politics. The inhumane living conditions. The living conditions the women experience are not humane. There's a history of the women being beaten into submission with whips, but the women have been in prison for so long and they are so broken and do not disobey. All the guards have to do is crack the whip in order to get the women to behave. The rules the guard imposes and the living conditions are terrifying and seek to symbolize the conditions of the camps. Being the last of your people. So it becomes very apparent very early in the novel that Lafia is going to outlive all the other women and be on her own for a few decades before she herself passes away. When the war ended, entire families were wiped out, but sometimes there would be sole survivors or maybe 1 or 2 survivors in a single family unit. Lafia ending up by herself is an attempt to capture the energy of what it was like to survive the Holocaust but be the only survivor of your circle of friends and family. The world can feel very alien when you are the last of everyone you ever knew. The youth. As humans, we tend to feel more righteous anger when children are placed into harm's way because of their innocence. A part of the Holocaust tragedy is the treatment of the children. From being experimented on to being subjected to these same inhospitable conditions as their fellow adults, it's already horrifying that anyone has to go through that, but so much more dreadful that not even children were spared. But something that the women theorize is that Lafia's presence in the prison is an accident, and the guards don't correct the accident because that would give the women information, and the guards, above all else, want to ensure the women stay in the dark about their plans. It is so easy to think that a child shouldn't have ended up in a place like this, and in all fairness, Lafia never notates another child in the prisons. I think Lafia thus is a representation of the Jewish children of the Holocaust, the one whose first memories are of the concentration camp, the ones who know nothing of the world before. Lafia has no frame of reference of a world before this misery. Her whole life is characterized by this tragedy. That's the way the Holocaust is for most Jewish families even today. There is no going back from that. There is no return to normalcy. The young guard. There is a young male guard that patrols with the rest of the guards, and we don't get his exact age, but Lafia suspects he's around her age. I presume this boy is a representation of the Hitler Youth. This was an indoctrination program the Nazis used to prepare the next generation. This young boy, much like older male guards, does not stray from his role as a guard, despite Lafia's best efforts. He, like them, flee when the alarm is raised. He is a product of whatever system is set out that puts people in cages and others as their guards. I am sure that there are more parts to this allegory, and if you've read the book and you've also spotted more parts of the Holocaust allegory, feel free to comment and share your thoughts. These are just the ones that I've noticed. The final thing I want to note before we move on is the bathroom situation. Part of the psychological warfare between the guards and the women is the lack of privacy. The toilet is the center of the cell, and the women will be beaten if they try to obscure the toilet to use it. It becomes a very big deal when they escape to have a private bathroom. Lafia doesn't understand why the toilet is a big deal because she's never experienced a private bathroom. When she does get to experience the private bathroom, she realizes it's the first time she's ever been alone without other women seeing her. This part reminded me of my foster care experience. Because of my medical condition, I spent a lot of time in the bathroom, and during foster care, we didn't yet know what was wrong with me, so I was punished by not being allowed to use the upstairs main bathroom, and I had to ask to go to the bathroom every time I went. I know, fucking crazy. It's just this strange observation that for some reason, when it comes to exerting control onto marginalized groups, it always comes back to the bathrooms. And it's never really about the bathrooms. The voice in this book is phenomenal. First of all, no complaints about the dialogue. The less I have to say about the dialogue, the better, because it shouldn't be something that I notice. Part of what makes Lafia an interesting narrator is her lack of understanding. Towards the beginning, she will use whatever language makes the most sense to her. She calls orgasms the eruption. The way Lafia perceives her fellow prisoners changes over time as she evolves from the rebellious teenager to the wise adult. Throughout the novel, Lafia alludes to the fact that she is aware she's telling this story. One of these instances is when Lafia is reacting to new things she has no words for, and because she is alone and has no one to help her anymore. Lafia uses the correct words to describe what she's interacting with, but she tells us at the time she had no idea what it was. She didn't want to bog down the story by trying to explain things she didn't know the identity of, but now does know. Like, try to explain, I don't know, a fridge without knowing what a fridge is. You know what I mean? If she figured out that it's a fridge, you might as well just call it a fridge. We also get another moment like this where Lafia is describing this road that she finds. There's like this road and there's a bus filled with men and they're all dead. And when she talks about this road, she says something like, I just realized I could have started walking the other way up the road but now it's too late. I love the reason that when she didn't turn around when the road ended, because she follows the road and it just abruptly ends. She didn't turn around and walk the other direction because it never occurred to her. It's so simple. I love it because, yeah, I mean, as a reader, we're the outsiders looking in. It seems like a no-brainer to turn around and go in the other direction. But when you're actually in the thick of it, sometimes you just don't consider things. It's just a natural part of the human experience. Eventually, we'll come to learn that this is an epistolary, so a story told in a format of a document. Most epistolaries tend to be told in the form of letters or diaries. The Dear America series is composed of epistolaries, and the author really takes advantage of this to develop Lafia's voice into something really distinct. It's one of the standout parts of the novel. So there are 40 women in total. We don't get a lot of characterization among the individual women. We learn bits and pieces about them which inform their lives and like what kind of lives they led beforehand. But the novel truly focuses on Lafia and sometimes Anthea, the woman who effectively raises Lafia. The rest of the time, the women are characterized kind of as like a singular unit. The thing that characterizes all of these women is loss. All of them remember their past lives, with only a lapse in memory being the event that brought them to the prison. A lot of them are mourning a life they soon begin realizing they will never be able to go back to. When Lafia doesn't understand why some women are reticent to talk about things like their own children, Anthea explains it's because it's likely their children are dead, and even if they aren't, These women are never going to see them again. This is another part of the Holocaust allegory, the destruction of these families, the never knowing if everyone else is dead, the dreadful realization that you will not be seeing them ever again regardless. Lafia also doesn't understand why the women bicker amongst each other about decisions they can't actually make. The prime example is how the women prepare food every night in the prison. They often discuss complicated ways to prepare the food and even argue over it, even if they can only prepare it one way with the tools provided, typically boiled with only salt and pepper for seasoning. It's only growing up that Lafia realizes that this communication is how the women kept each other sane, that communication is what's keeping them all alive. It's how they're passing through the day. It also helps them be distinct from one another. But because Lafia sees them all within this sameness, she doesn't often make distinctions between the various women. It's very easy to mix up one woman for another. The women don't talk about their lives before mostly because by the time Lafia is old enough to ask questions, the women have spent years exhausting them, hashing and rehashing their past, and eventually there's just nothing more to talk about. Anthea is the only named woman that really has a distinct personality, except for maybe Dorothy, and I think her name is Dorothy. But Dorothy is like an old woman whose main personality is being an old woman who demands respect because she's an elder. There is not much more to it. Anthea is more honest with Lafia and ultimately is the one who answers all of Lafia's questions, from how sex works to what the women know about the imprisonment. Anthea, like the rest, did not bother telling Lafia anything because she didn't see the point. But Lafia brings up a very important counterpoint, which is that soon Lafia will be the last woman all alone, and she might need to know things, and it's better she's told now before no one is left to help her. That's how Lafia knows she's dying of something that is afflicting her womb, because Anthea covered the fundamentals of biology for her. It's also how Lafia is able to eventually identify pieces of technology that she doesn't understand when she gets to that underground hatch, because she can recall the stories that Anthea told her. Let's look at our unnamed protagonist, Lafia. Together with Isaac Clarke, the two of them make one fully functional protagonist for the absolute horrors of being alone in the worst hell imaginable. At the time, she is referred to as the child, which is why I'm calling her Lafia, which again means the female child in French. She bears no name because the women couldn't get her to tell them her name, and throughout her life, Lafia never felt it necessary to give herself this piece of identity. She is just one of the masses, a nameless dead woman among millions. Perhaps she saw no purpose in having a name. Very early on, Lafia realizes she's going to outlive the rest of the women, and if you are alone, do you truly have a name? She is the last person alive on this dismal planet. There's no one to confuse her with. She is the prisoner, the child, the woman, the survivor, the dead. Something I didn't love about her character, which I am immediately going to argue against my own disdain, is how Lafia gives up at the end of the novel. The underground hatch that she finds has astronautics books and instruments that Lafia doesn't understand, and eventually she stops trying to figure out how to send a distress signal with this technology. On the one hand, this seems like a grand departure from her character, Lafia the curious, Lafia the determined to find an answer. She becomes a skilled carpenter that when nothing is left to build, she dreams of going off on her own to explore more bunkers to find more answers. When she finds a dead bus filled with soldiers, she raids their belongings and finds a garden manual, and that's how she teaches herself how to read. You know how long that would have to take? So why now, with technology that could grant her rescue and answers, does she give up? Perhaps it's because Lafia has become like the woman she once criticized. Lafia always saw her fellow women prisoners as complacent because they're idiots. But now that she has lived this full life, she now understands their complacency came from exhaustion. Lafia has no memory of these women and their determination in the early years of imprisonment. She only knew them as broken and desperate to die. Even when Lafia gives them hope by turning into a human clock, there's not much more they're willing to do. Lafia is the only one who keeps pushing them forward because everyone is so exhausted that they have fully given up. Lafia could be dying anywhere between her 40s and 60s. She goes at least 2 decades alone with only corpses for company. Despite once being annoyed at the adults allegedly not trying hard enough to escape, Lafayette now finds herself in their place. She is burned out, and there's no new generation to keep the candle burning. I also theorize that Lafayette gives up on finding rescue because the only world she has ever known are prisons and cages. This book highlights often that Lafayette's lack of memories from a previous life sets her apart from the other woman. There's nothing for Lafayette to miss. There is nothing for her to want because this is all she's known. Knowing that she grew up in a prison and escaped to a bigger, lonelier one, how could we expect Lafayette to have hope that the rescue will be a rescue and not just another prison? I think this novel really does well to highlight where the indomitable human spirit begins to rot. It is a flame hard to uphold without a support system. I am sat in this paradox of both believing this is a departure of her character, but also believing that it does fit within the themes of the book. I also think that this is a part of the Holocaust allegory. As a woman, I can understand the existential dread of how misogyny never ends. It doesn't matter how much we evolve in society. Our history is an epic poem about men who hate women. There's always something new, a rebrand of bigotry every decade while women fight tooth and nail to sit at a table Jesus Christ himself would have flipped. But we can't flip it because it's just so unladylike. Likewise, this never-ending fight applies to the Jewish community. Anti-Semitism never seems to end. There is always a new era, a new hatred burning in the hearts of people who can recognize the word empathy on a page, but to them it's just a series of definitionless letters, gibberish, nonsense, nothing. It is exhausting being the forever advocate and eternal activist. It is not shocking to see people become disenchanted and disillusioned, because the people who celebrate in the misery they create for others are the people who need to care, and they simply don't. How long can an activist engage with uncouth, belligerent individuals who just don't care about anything unless it directly affects them before that activist taps out of the fight because it's just so exhausting? How many times do we have to repeat never again, not another Holocaust, and yet, and yet, and yet? That's what Lafayette's despair feels like. Lafayette ends the epistolary with hope that someone will find it. She is writing this down believing that someone else is out there which might be symbolic of the next generation. The ones who will have to bear the world's weight of activism on their shoulder, because the moment any of us stop is the moment we lose everything. Every activist is Atlas, who must always hold up the world. I think there's a sense of dread when we, in the real world, pass this torch. It feels like failure. We didn't accomplish what we had hoped we would. We didn't make the world we wanted our children to live in. But the next generation is always angrier and more determined. It might be enough to make progress in this battle of the inches to be recognized as a person. BioShock Infinite is not a very good game. But there is a very poignant quote said by the protagonist companion, Elizabeth, that I think about almost every day. After waiting for several decades to be rescued, when the protagonist finally gets there and realizes that Elizabeth has given in to the antagonist's demand, Elizabeth says, "Time rots everything, even hope." On that cheerful note, let's take a look into the atmosphere. There are two parts, believability and the emotional atmosphere. I want to believe the world I'm reading in, and I want to feel it too. This is a novel fermenting in existential dread. We carry to the bitter end that Lafayette will outlive everyone. She is doomed to be alone. Much like Isaac Clarke of Dead Space, they are subjected to their respective horrors, and they have no choice but to keep existing through it. There is also a lot of sorrow, the feeling of detachment and loss, of not understanding why we're here and what it all means, moments of hope that are ultimately fleeting. The world's believability is strong for reasons we've already covered. The author is very effective at writing around the answer, or the writing is strong enough that it feels like she was writing around the answers. The abstract nature of the book is cleverly designed to give the reader space to interpret, and while the book is guiding us towards a cluster of interpretations, we are not restricted by that cluster. The research of the novel is also fairly immaculate. As previously stated, this is a Holocaust allegory. So when we discuss the themes, there are two to be aware of, subject themes and pervasive themes. We'll start with the subject ones. Subject themes are the topic the novel wishes to explore in conjunction with the plot. These are specific, like generational trauma or beauty culture. This book has themes of parentification, is how we would word talking about subject themes. I, who have never known men, has subject themes of privacy, control, womanhood, female friendships, hope, but also disillusionment. I also interpret it to be about the way activism burns you out when you realize you're going to be doing this for your whole life, and the moment you stop, you risk your rights being stripped away. There's also a lot of religious imagery going on. When it comes to female friendships, this book truly focuses on women as a community, the way they prepare their meals together, the collective horror at having to use the bathroom on display. When the women break out of the bunker, the first thing they do is set up a private bathroom area. It's the first piece of agency they take back from their captors. We also see these women struggle to remain together and struggle to give their fellow women their dying wishes. Dorothy, one of the oldest members of the group, refuses to die without her dignity and is actually carried on a stretcher until she passes away. There is a profound love on behalf of the women that they put in the work of not leaving Dorothy behind. We also see the women fall in love with each other. A few couples develop over the course of the novel, which Lafia doesn't quite understand until Anthea gives her a proper sexual education. Lafia is just confused by romance in general. This seems entirely banal, but that's the point. The way that female friendships are typically represented in media have unspoken cattiness or animosity. All women secretly hate each other because they're all in competition with each other. Now, this is a concept that's on its way out. More and more, we're seeing positive female friendships being shown on screen. But this was written in 1995, which I feel is a bit ahead of its time. The prison setup does attempt to keep these women isolated. One of the prison rules is that the women are not allowed to touch each other in any way. Lafia tries at one point at night when it's dark, and the whip gets cracked in her direction. When the women break out of the surface, there's this catharsis at being able to touch each other by holding hands, patting shoulders, or hugging. There are some religious themes to this novel, specifically some more Christian themes. One of the women in the group knows a Latin funeral song, and several other women whisper Christian prayers. I think we hear the Hail Mary once or twice. There is this hold on to these beliefs because they are a part of that old life, one that is gone from them. Lafia is generally apathetic about a god given her circumstances. I personally don't think the choice to have Christian imagery is any deeper than Christianity being a very popular religion, so statistically these women would be Christian and not Jewish. 30% of the world is roughly Christian and 0.2 is Jewish. And anti-Semitism is so rampant. It's so ridiculous. 0.2? That's who you're concerned about? 0.2? Be fucking for real. In biblical numerology, 40, the number 40, tends to be representative of the passage of time and a period of trial. The earth is flooded for 40 days. The Israelites wandered the desert for 40 years. Jesus spends 40 days in the desert. Elijah spends 40 days without food or water on Mount Horeb. It seems evident that 40 might have been a popular number to indicate a passage of time as decreed by God, but also a spiritual trial period set forth by God. This is similar, like in fairy tales, everything tends to come in sets of threes. So what does this mean for our 40 women? Considering how time is very important to this novel, just the concept of time itself, as well as feeling like you're undergoing an ordeal, the inclusion of 40 seems very apt. I'm willing to bet that Lafia roams by herself for 40 years, placing her at about 60 at the time of her death. In the book of Revelation, in the Bible, we have a passage that suggests people of all walks of life will hide in caves and mountains. They ask God to close off the cave to save them from the wrath of the apocalypse. There's also a passage about the 144,000 faithful of God who will be housed and protected from the end of the world and will spread the gospel when it is over. Now, the numerology of this number, 144,000, is actually a derivative of 12, which is considered a holy number in the Tanakh in the New Testament. But I will point out that 40 also goes into it, which is a result of 3,600. I think that there are probably 3,600 bunkers total. Do I think the guards might have borrowed biblical numerology for this very evil project? Yes. I think it's intentional because it's an important characteristic of the Nazi regime that Hitler marketed himself as a Christian man. His particular beliefs rejected most Christian doctrines and completely ignored the Tanakh, which Christians will call the Old Testament. It's also widely understood by historians and Christians that Hitler didn't actually have Christian beliefs, but recognized that by using German civil religion, he could get Christian Germans to side with Nazis under the banner of having the same Christian faith. So yeah, I think the Guards would have absolutely appropriated this numerology. It's also possible that the event the women don't seem to remember was the biblical apocalypse as described in Revelation, and they are the 144,000 that were supposed to be spared in order to spread the gospel. But something happened. Something went wrong. This supposedly safe haven has been overtaken by evil. This isn't the main theory I subscribe to, but it is something interesting to consider. Moving on to the next type of theme. Pervasive themes are the recurring motifs that come together to give us what the book seeks to say. These will be more vague, like love and hope. This book is about grief, is how we would word talking about pervasive themes. I Who Have Never Known Men is about loss. Loss of life, of future, of procreation. Loss of meaning and connection in human rights. Every page is littered with the loss these women feel, from the lives they once led to every bunker they find filled with all the dead. There is also the loss of what could have been, the normal life Lafia could have participated in. Given the abstract and allegorical nature of the book, I knew the theme section wasn't going to be very long because in order to talk about this book, I have to be interpreting the themes for any of this to make any sense to all of you guys. But something I've been alluding to the entire time is because the book is abstract, it is designed to be theorized. So in this section, I'm also going to be covering my theory as to what I think happened in this story. This is just an interpretation of the text, and you might have a different theory of what happened, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, so let me know what you think in the comments. But before that, really quick, I have nowhere else to put this piece of data, but when you're reading the book, and maybe it's just me and my interest in Holocaust literature, but the Holocaust allegory was very apparent to me. At the end of the book, Lafia finds a bus filled with dead soldiers, and each one has a book, and it ends up being a garden manual. But I thought the book was either going to be the Bible or Mein Kampf. It wasn't either, but I really thought that's where we were going. Okay. On to what I think happened in I Who Have Never Known Men. Let's understand the Guards as the upper class. They are the people in power. It was a standard issue to give each guard a gardening book, which implies that there was a desire to homestead. Perhaps these guards did not start out as guards, but as men trying to cultivate this new planet and ended up in this guard position out of necessity, perhaps to save on money. The planet is temperate with no change of season, which also suggests this might be a planet picked to colonize. The colonization of this planet is not sanctioned by any government the reader could reasonably recognize. None of the guards are wearing anything that indicates a nation or a collective. Even if Lafia did not recognize an icon, if she described, let's say, a rectangle with red and white stripes, a blue square that had little dots on it, we would know that's an American flag. The group intending to colonize this planet might be doing so illegally. All of the guards are men. Nothing ever suggests that women are ever guards. We do find that men are also prisoners, but they are kept separate from the women. The power dynamic between guard and prisoner is clearly that of exerting control because they can. This is also why I think the occupation of this planet is illegal. The women recall lives on Earth. What is happening on this planet is a war crime. I think the men and women kidnapped to these prisons were meant to make up a slave class. It's notated that all the women do not know each other, but they do all come from blue-collar, traditionally female occupations, and what is commonly understood as unskilled laborer backgrounds. I think the prisoner class was meant to be laborers of some kind, and the women all seem to fit a very conservative idea of female gender role. Perhaps because these women of the slave class were going to be performing this gender role of being keepers of the house and mothers. While I can't say for sure about the men because we never meet a single living male prisoner, they might have been captured to be laborers while the women act as wives, maids, and mothers. This way the guard class can live in luxury, avoiding the toils of Adam while forcing it upon other men, and subjecting women to the toils of Eve with no possibility of being anything more than that. Lafia, the child, was brought in by accident. It's alluded to several times in the book, and I think this is true only because it makes the guards seem imperfect, whereas they seem so perfect in every part of their duty. This gives credence to the alarms blaring. Something went wrong, and it's possible for them to mess things up because a child was brought in by accident. The bunkers are set up in groups of 5, with one in the center, and they're all very spaced out from each other. I think the people in charge have a map of this planet and were evenly dividing land between all the participants. Each bunker represented a homestead and would house the population of the slave class. Each colonizer would need to ensure they reaped the benefits of the land without having to do any of the work. The reason why there is this waiting period where the women don't seem to know why they were captured in the first place is because the operation ran out of funds. Clearly, a lot of money went into the painstakingly development of all of these bunkers, where there are clearly thousands of them, but also staging worldwide attacks that allow them to kidnap so many people. Those cages are so well built that not a single prisoner could break them down, even with 40 people working together. That's expensive. Food has to be shipped there because it's clear there's not being grown there. That's also expensive. Part of the original plan was to keep the prisoners waiting long enough to break their spirits so that the slave class is compliant. That's why the project started out with the underground bunkers and the kidnapping, because it would take years, perhaps a decade of being imprisoned, before everyone was physically and emotionally damaged to a point of compliance. The women with Lafia are certainly apathetic. They are at a point where they're just waiting to die, but because this project ran out of money, the waiting period was extended and re-extended. The group running this operation pulled the plug because they might have been discovered. Perhaps information leaked or someone was arrested who might talk. Since the guards see these people as resources and not as humans, it would be easy to cut their losses and run if it meant avoiding prison. Again, because we know the women are from Earth, we know whatever going on at this planet is a war crime. It's illegal. The other thing that might have happened is that another group of prisoners might have escaped, and they're the ones who killed the guards on the bus. The reason we don't run into them is because they went in the opposite direction of the road that Lafia went down. The bus is the only time their paths would have intersected. Given that no one rescues the prisoners, this might mean that technology isn't readily available to launch a rescue mission. Anyone who could help had no idea that there were people needing to be rescued, or this planet is just that big and the rescue efforts have started very far away and never reached Lafia before she herself dies. The bunker Lafia finds at the end implies that there has been space travel occurring with an astronautics book. This man is a scientist and might have been the head of operations. Given that his location was seemingly secret, nobody might have known that he was living down there on the planet in such great conditions. It might have been a secret from the guard class. The astronautics book does imply that this isn't a raised post-apocalyptic Earth, but an entirely new planet. Though I think there is some credence to a theory they're still on Earth, I just don't really think so because of the astronautic stuff. The guard class lives on spaceships orbiting the planet. It's the only thing that makes sense. There's no clear marker of civilization. Orbiting the planet, they'd have plausible deniability, especially because they leave no meaningful trace of themselves on the planet. There's something that gets pointed out by the women as they explore new bunkers. There's no trace of the guards, no playing cards or stubbed out cigarettes, nothing that really says that they were there. Another theory about the men on the bus is that the men were killed because the operation collapsed and the last group on their way out either had to save themselves or potentially be trapped on the planet with the guards on the bus. They chose to save themselves, destroying the bus so they would be no one alive to talk to in case help for the prisoners did arrive. Lafia not getting her period is not indicative of her body going through some kind of evolution because it knows there are no men to procreate with. It's an indication that something is wrong with her uterus, which ends up being the thing that kills her. It's also possible that Lafia is intersex with female-presenting characteristics because we don't really know much about her sex characteristics in comparison to what's normal. We do know that while she can orgasm through imaginative situations, she finds no actual pleasure in physical stimulation, which might be connected to her gynecological issues. Sometimes when you're born or develop one condition, it can come with some bonus problems. So I'm not saying her damaged uterus is why she's having problems with physical pleasure, but whatever is wrong with her might have been a package deal. It's also entirely possible that she's just asexual who doesn't specifically feel any arousal with physical stimulation. I think this book is a great book to case study if you're trying to figure out how to write an abstract novel. The most important takeaway is how Jacqueline Ochman writes around the answers, guiding us to a cluster of answers, but by no means forcing us to stay in that cluster as we attempt to figure out what's going on in the story. If you're a fan of like David Lynch or Petscop or House of Leaves, I think you'll actually really like this book. Art is subjective, and attempting to assert objectivity onto art is a waste of time. I think everyone wants to read good books. We just have different ideas of what a good book is. So whether you loved this one or hated it, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your interpretations. That's all we have for today. The madness has ended, and you can go in peace.